The fire would come for them both. But first, the silence nearly killed them. Ethan Cole stood at the window of his dying ranch, watching dust devils spiral across land he could no longer hold. 6 hired hands gone, creditors circling. Then a wagon appeared on the horizon, carrying a widow and child who would change everything. Clara Hale didn't come looking for love. She came looking for survival. But when wildfire tore across the Wyoming plains, they would face a choice: burn alone or stand together and fight for something neither believed they deserved. Stay with us until the end, hit that like button, and comment your city below so we can see how far this story travels. The ranch house stood like a headstone against the Wyoming sky. Weathered gray wood, windows that reflected nothing but emptiness, a porch that hadn't heard laughter in 3 years. Ethan Cole leaned against the doorframe, coffee gone cold in his tin cup, watching the sun climb over land that felt more like a burden than a birthright every passing day. 600 acres, 200 head of cattle, maybe fewer now. He'd lost count when he'd lost the last of his hands. The bunkhouse sat empty, doors banging in the wind like the whole place was trying to shake itself apart from the inside out. He was 34 years old and felt twice that. "Mr. Cole?" The voice came from behind him, thin and uncertain. Ethan turned to find Tommy Preston, the 15-year-old son of his nearest neighbor, standing in the yard with his hat crushed between nervous hands. "Your pa send you?" Ethan's voice came out rougher than he intended, scraped raw from days of talking only to horses and himself. "No, sir. Came on my own." Tommy's eyes darted to the ground. "Heard you put up a notice in town about needing help." Ethan had posted that notice 2 weeks ago in a moment of desperation he'd regretted ever since. He'd been specific: experienced ranch hand, must know cattle and horses, willing to work for room and board until the fall sale. He'd gotten exactly 0 responses. "You ever worked cattle before, Tommy?" "Some. Pa lets me help with ours." "Your pa's got 30 head on 50 acres. I've got 200 on 600, and most of the fencing's down on the north quarter. It's not the same thing." Tommy's shoulders sagged, but he didn't leave. "I know that, sir, but I'm strong, and I learn quick, and—" He stopped, swallowed hard. "And I heard you're in trouble, real trouble. Figured maybe you couldn't afford to be picky." The honesty of it hit Ethan like a fist to the gut. The boy was right. He couldn't afford to be picky. He couldn't afford much of anything anymore. "You know why my hands left?" Ethan asked quietly. Tommy nodded. "They said the work was too hard and the pay too slow." "That's the polite version." Ethan drained the last of his bitter coffee. "Truth is, I ran out of money to pay them. Promised them shares of the fall sale instead, but they didn't want to wait. Can't blame them for that." "I'd wait," Tommy said quickly. "I don't need money right now. My pa feeds me fine. He stopped again, and this time when he looked up, there was something fierce in his young eyes. "I just want to prove I can do real work. Man's work." Ethan studied him for a long moment. Tommy Preston was tall for 15, broad in the shoulders, with calloused hands that suggested he wasn't afraid of hard labor. But he was still a boy, and this ranch would chew him up and spit him out before summer's end. "Go home, Tommy," Ethan said finally. "I appreciate the offer, but I can't take on someone your age. Your pa would have my hide, and he'd be right to." Disappointment flooded Tommy's face, but he nodded and turned to go. He'd made it halfway to his horse when Ethan called out. "Tell your pa I said thank you, though, for raising a son brave enough to offer help when it's needed." Tommy's face brightened slightly. He mounted up and rode off, leaving Ethan alone again with the wind and the silence and the weight of everything slowly falling apart. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of necessary tasks that felt increasingly futile. Ethan checked the water troughs, mended a section of corral fence that wouldn't hold through another storm, and tried not to think about the bank letter sitting on his kitchen table. Mr. Harrison at the Cheyenne Savings and Loan had been patient, more patient than Ethan deserved. But patience had limits, and Ethan had reached them. 6 months, the letter said. 6 months to bring the mortgage current or face foreclosure proceedings. 6 months. Might as well have been 6 days for all the difference it made. Without help, he couldn't manage the herd. Without the herd, he couldn't make the fall sale. Without the sale, he couldn't pay the bank. The mathematics of failure were brutally simple. He was washing up at the pump when he heard it, the distant creak and rattle of wagon wheels. Ethan straightened, water dripping from his face and hands, squinting against the afternoon sun. A small covered wagon was making its way up the long drive, pulled by a single tired-looking mare. Not Tommy again. The wagon was wrong, and besides, the boy had gone home hours ago. Ethan dried his hands on his trousers and waited, curiosity mixing with irritation. He wasn't in the mood for visitors, and he certainly wasn't in the mood for whatever peddler or preacher had mistaken his ranch for a place that could spare time or money for their goods or salvation. The wagon drew closer, and Ethan realized the driver wasn't a man at all. A woman sat on the bench, reins held steady in gloved hands, posture straight despite the obvious exhaustion in her face. She wore a simple gray dress and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed her features. Beside her, a child, a girl, maybe 6 or 7, peered out with wide, curious eyes. The woman pulled the wagon to a stop 20 feet from where Ethan stood. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. She studied him with the same careful assessment he gave her, taking measure, making calculations he couldn't read. Then she climbed down from the wagon with practiced grace, every movement deliberate and controlled. When she removed her hat, Ethan felt something shift in his chest. Not attraction, not exactly, though she was undeniably beautiful. No, it was something deeper and more unsettling, recognition. Not of her face, which he'd never seen before, but of the look in her eyes. The same look he saw in his own mirror every morning. The look of someone who'd lost something vital and was still trying to figure out how to live without it. "Mr. Cole?" Her voice was low and steady, shaped by education but weathered by hardship. "My name is Clara Hale. I've come about your notice." Ethan blinked. "My notice? In town. You're looking for help." She glanced back at the child in the wagon, then returned her gaze to him. "I can cook, clean, mend, and manage a household. My daughter Lily won't be any trouble. She's quiet and well-behaved. All I'm asking for is room and board in exchange for honest work." The words landed like stones, each one carefully placed, revealing nothing of desperation but everything of determination. "Ma'am," Ethan started, then stopped. He didn't know how to say this without sounding cruel. "I appreciate you coming all this way, but my notice was for ranch work, cattle and horses. I wasn't looking for a woman?" Clara's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. "I understand, but if you'll permit me to speak plainly, Mr. Cole, you look like a man who hasn't had a proper meal in weeks. Your shirt needs mending, your house needs cleaning, and unless I'm mistaken, you've been trying to do everything yourself since your hands left." Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it. She wasn't wrong. "I'm not asking for wages," Clara continued, "just a roof and food for myself and my daughter. A few months of work, enough to save a little and move on when the season changes. I won't trouble you beyond that, and I promise you'll eat better than you have in years." There was no pleading in her voice, no attempt at manipulation, just simple, stark honesty. And in that honesty, Ethan heard the unspoken truth. She was as desperate as he was, just in different ways. "Where's your husband?" he asked, then immediately regretted the bluntness of it. Clara's face remained steady, but her hands tightened slightly on the hat she held. "Dead, 2 years now. We were living in Laramie. After he passed, things became difficult. Lily and I have been moving from place to place, taking work where we can find it. Your notice in town seemed like Providence." "Providence?" Ethan repeated quietly. He'd stopped believing in that particular commodity about the same time he'd stopped believing the ranch could be saved. "Or desperation recognizing itself," Clara said, and for the first time something like a smile ghosted across her face. "I won't pretend to know the difference anymore." The child, Lily, climbed down from the wagon then, moving with the careful steps of someone used to being unnoticed. She was small for her age, with her mother's dark hair and a face that held too much solemnity for childhood. She didn't speak, just stood close to Clara's skirts, one small hand gripping the fabric. Ethan looked at them both, this widow and her silent daughter, appearing on his dying ranch like some kind of answer to a prayer he hadn't prayed, and felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle heavier on his shoulders. He should send them away. He could barely feed himself, let alone 2 more mouths. The ranch was failing, and taking them in would just mean more people to witness the collapse. But then he thought about the empty house, the cold meals, the silence that had grown so thick he sometimes forgot what his own voice sounded like. He thought about Tommy Preston's words. Figured maybe you couldn't afford to be picky. Kitchen needs work, he heard himself say. Stove smokes something fierce, and the pump inside doesn't always catch. There's a room off the kitchen that's clean enough, has a bed and a window. It's not much. Claire's shoulders relaxed fractionally, the first sign that she'd been holding tension Ethan hadn't even noticed. It's more than we have now, Mr. Cole. We'll take it, and thank you. Don't thank me yet, Ethan said roughly. Ranch work starts before dawn and doesn't end till after dark. I can't pay you, can't promise you anything beyond the basics. And when this place finally goes under... He stopped, the words catching in his throat. When it goes under, you'll need to move on quick. I won't be able to help you then. I understand. Clara bent down, murmured something to Lily that Ethan couldn't hear, then straightened. Shall we bring our things in? They didn't have much. 2 worn carpet bags, a wooden crate, and a battered trunk that took both Ethan and Clara to lift down from the wagon. The whole of their lives packed up and portable, ready to move at a moment's notice. Ethan had never had to live that way, had always had the ranch as an anchor, but he recognized the particular kind of exhaustion that came from having nowhere to truly rest. He led them inside, acutely aware of how the house must look through a stranger's eyes. Dust filmed every surface. Dishes sat unwashed in the basin. His bedroll lay crumpled in the corner of the main room because he'd stopped bothering with the bedroom upstairs months ago. The whole place smelled of loneliness and neglect. Clara took it all in without comment, her face revealing nothing. Lily stayed close to her mother's side, those wide eyes missing nothing. The room's through here, Ethan said, leading them to a small space off the kitchen. It had been the housekeeper's quarters back when his parents ran the place, back when the ranch was thriving and the house full of life. Now it held a narrow bed, a washstand, and memories of better times. It's perfect, Clara said quietly, and Ethan couldn't tell if she meant it or if she was just too tired to be particular. I'll let you get settled, he said, backing toward the door. If you need anything, we'll be fine, Mr. Cole. And thank you, truly. He nodded and left them there, retreating to the barn where the familiar smell of horses and hay helped settle the strangeness of having people in his house again. The mare from Clara's wagon needed tending, and he busied himself with unhitching her, checking her hooves, measuring out grain. Simple tasks, knowable tasks. By the time he finished, the sun had dropped low, painting the sky in shades of copper and flame. He stood in the barn doorway, watching light gild the land, and tried not to think about what he'd just done. Tried not to calculate the additional risk, the added responsibility, the ways this could go wrong. The smell hit him as he crossed the yard, something savory and rich, completely unlike the beans and hardtack he'd been living on. His stomach twisted with hunger so sharp it nearly doubled him over. When had he last eaten a real meal? 2 days ago? 3? He pushed open the kitchen door to find it transformed. Not clean, Clara couldn't have worked miracles in a few hours, but cleaner. The dishes were washed and stacked. The table had been wiped down. And at the stove, her back to him, Clara stood stirring something in his mother's old cast-iron pot, the one he'd forgotten he even had. It's just stew, she said without turning around. Nothing fancy. I found potatoes in your cellar, and there was an onion that hadn't gone soft yet. The beef is from a tin I had in my stores. It'll do for tonight. Tomorrow I can inventory what you have and plan properly. Ethan couldn't speak. He stood there, hat in hands, and felt something crack open inside him, something he'd sealed shut and buried deep because it hurt too much to feel. Mr. Cole? Clara turned then, concern crossing her face. Are you all right? Fine, he managed, his voice thick. I'm fine. Just thank you for this. She nodded, accepting his gratitude without making a fuss over it. Lily's already eaten and fallen asleep. The journey wore her out, but there's plenty here if you're hungry. He was beyond hungry. He was hollowed out and running on nothing but stubbornness and coffee. But when Clara ladled stew into a bowl and set it before him at the table, When the steam rose carrying sense of home and care and normalcy, Ethan found he couldn't quite bring himself to eat. Not yet. Not while she stood there watching him with those careful, guarded eyes. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the other chair. "You must be hungry too." "I can eat later." "Sit." It came out more command than request, and Clara's eyebrows rose slightly, but she sat, folding her hands in her lap, waiting. Ethan took a breath, then picked up his spoon. The first bite hit his tongue like a revelation, not because it was particularly fancy or complicated, but because it tasted like someone gave a damn whether he lived or died. He closed his eyes, swallowed, and had to fight the embarrassing burn of tears. When he opened them again, Clara was looking away, giving him the privacy of his reaction. It was such a small kindness, but it undid him completely. They ate in silence, the only sounds the scrape of spoons against bowls and the ticking of the old clock on the mantel that had stopped keeping accurate time years ago, but that Ethan had never bothered to fix. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows, reminding them both that Wyoming was not a gentle place, that summer's warmth was a temporary gift soon to be revoked. "Why did you really come here?" Ethan asked finally, setting down his spoon. "Towns full of ranches closer to Cheyenne, bigger spreads with more security. Why mine?" Clara was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the grain of the wooden table. When she spoke, her voice was low and careful. "The other ranches already had help. Yours was the only notice that seemed genuine. Most men looking for help are looking for—" She paused, choosing her words. "Something other than work. But your notice was specific, direct. It sounded like you meant what you said and weren't interested in complications." "I'm not," Ethan said quickly, wanting to make that clear. "I'm not looking for anything but help keeping this place running long enough to make the fall sale. After that—" He stopped, unsure how much honesty was too much. "After that, you'll lose it anyway," Clara finished quietly. "I heard talk in town. About the bank? About the foreclosure?" Shame flooded through him, hot and bitter. "Then you know this is a sinking ship you've climbed aboard." "I know you're fighting to save something that matters to you," Clara said. "That's more than most men are doing. And for what it's worth, Mr. Cole, I've been on enough sinking ships to know how to swim. Lily and I won't drown you. We'll pull our weight until it's time to move on." There was no pity in her voice, no judgment, just simple acknowledgement of reality. Somehow that made it easier to bear. "Call me Ethan," he said. "Mr. Cole was my father, and he's been dead long enough that the title doesn't fit me anymore." "Ethan, then." Clara stood, gathering their empty bowls. "And you can call me Clara. Mrs. Hale feels like someone I stopped being 2 years ago." She moved to the basin, and Ethan found himself watching her. The efficient economy of her movements, the way she'd already memorized where things belonged in a kitchen she'd been in for less than a day. There was something both foreign and familiar about having another person in this space, about the soft sounds of domesticity he'd forgotten could exist. "I should check the stock one more time before dark," he said, standing abruptly, needing distance from the unexpected intimacy of the moment. "I'll be back in an hour or so. Help yourself to whatever you need." Clara nodded, not looking up from the dishes. "We'll be here." Such simple words, but they lodged somewhere deep in Ethan's chest. "We'll be here." As if the being here mattered, as if his presence or absence made some kind of difference to someone. He left before he could examine that feeling too closely, escaping into the familiar solitude of evening chores. But as he moved through the barn, checking each stall, ensuring water and feed, he found his thoughts drifting back to the house, to the light now burning in the kitchen window, to the woman and child sheltering under his roof, to the strange sensation of the ranch feeling less like a tomb and more like something that might, against all odds, still be alive. When he finally returned to the house, Clara had retreated to her room, the door closed but a thin line of lamplight visible beneath it. The kitchen had been cleaned and set right for morning. On the table, she'd left him a plate covered with a cloth, bread and cheese, and some of the stew still warm. Ethan stood there in the dim lamplight, holding that plate, and felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years of slow decay and mounting desperation. Hope. It was small and fragile and probably foolish, but it flickered there nonetheless, stubborn as a match flame in wind. He ate slowly, savoring every bite, then banked the fire and climbed the stairs to his actual bedroom for the first time in months. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new configurations of impossible mathematics and failing systems. But tonight, the house felt different. Tonight, it felt like something more than just walls and regret. Tonight, it felt like it remembered how to breathe. Dawn came cold and blue, the kind of morning that promised heat later but started with a bite that made breath visible and fingers stiff. Ethan woke to the smell of coffee, real coffee, strong and bitter, and for a disoriented moment thought he'd slipped backward through time to when his mother still lived, when the house hummed with purpose and the future seemed certain. Then memory caught up with him, and he remembered the widow and her silent daughter sleeping in the room below. He dressed quickly, splashed water on his face from the basin, and descended the narrow stairs to find Clara already moving through the kitchen with quiet efficiency. She'd tied her dark hair back with a simple ribbon, and in the early light filtering through the window, she looked younger than she had yesterday, or perhaps just less guarded, her face softened by the routine of familiar work. "Morning," Ethan said, his voice still rough with sleep. Clara turned, startled. "I didn't mean to wake you. I tried to be quiet." "You were. I'm used to getting up early." He moved to the stove where the coffee pot sat, poured himself a cup. "How'd you sleep?" "Well enough." She returned to the dough she'd been kneading, her hands working the pale mass with practiced rhythm. "The bed's comfortable." Lily didn't stir once. Ethan leaned against the counter, watching her work. There was something hypnotic about it. The push and fold, the way flour dusted her fingers, the complete absorption in the task. His mother used to make bread every Saturday morning, filling the house with yeast and warmth. He hadn't tasted fresh bread in 3 years. "You don't have to do all this," he said quietly. "The bread, I mean. Biscuits would have been fine." "I like making bread." Clara didn't look up, kept her focus on the dough. "It's honest work. Gives you something real to show for your time. Besides, a man working a ranch needs more than biscuits and coffee to keep going." She wasn't wrong, but Ethan felt the weight of the gesture nonetheless, the extra effort, the care embedded in something as simple as risen dough. He drained his coffee, set the cup in the basin. "I need to ride out to the North Quarter today," he said. "Check the fencing, look for strays. I'll probably be gone most of the day." "We'll be fine here." Clara covered the dough with a cloth, set it near the stove to rise. "I thought I'd do a proper inventory of the pantry and cellar, see what you have and what you need. If you have a wagon I can use, maybe I could drive into town later this week for supplies. Town's 8 miles. I've driven farther." She wiped her hands on her apron, met his eyes directly. "I'm not afraid of distance, Ethan, or work. That's why I'm here." Something in her tone, not defensive but firm, made him nod. "Wagon's in the barn. Mare's probably still tired from yesterday, but she should be rested enough by tomorrow or the next day." A small sound came from the doorway then. Lily, standing barefoot in her nightgown, rubbing sleep from her eyes with one fist. She looked even smaller in the morning light, like a child made of porcelain who might shatter if handled roughly. "Good morning, sweetheart," Clara said, her whole demeanor softening. "You're up early." Lily didn't answer, just patted across the floor to press against her mother's side. Clara stroked her hair absently, and Ethan felt like an intruder watching them, this small, self-contained unit of two that needed nothing from him beyond the shelter he'd already provided. "I should get started," he said, backing toward the door. "There's eggs in the coop if you want them. Chickens are temperamental, but they're still laying." "Thank you." Clara's voice followed him out. "Be careful out there." The words were automatic, the kind of thing anyone might say, but they caught in Ethan's chest anyway. It had been a long time since anyone had told him to be careful, since his safety mattered to another living soul. He saddled his horse, a rangy gelding named Flint who'd been with him since the beginning, and headed north as the sun climbed higher, burning off the morning chill. The land stretched out around him in rolling waves of prairie grass gone gold in the summer heat, dotted with sage and the occasional stand of cottonwoods marking where water ran underground. Beautiful country, harsh country, the kind that demanded everything and gave back only what you could wrest from it by force of will. The North Quarter was 3 miles out, and by the time Ethan reached it, he could see the damage was worse than he'd feared. Whole sections of fence were down, wire tangled and posts rotted through. He counted 15 heads scattered across the neighboring spread, grazing on someone else's land. He'd have to round them up, mend the fence, and pray his neighbor didn't decide to charge him for the grass they'd eaten. He worked through the morning and into the afternoon, the sun climbing to its apex and bearing down with relentless force. Sweat soaked through his shirt, gathered in the brim of his hat, dripped into his eyes. His hands bled from wrestling with barbed wire, and his back screamed from digging new post holes in earth gone hard as iron. But the work was good, necessary. It gave him something concrete to focus on, something besides the impossible math of saving the ranch or the unsettling presence of Clara Hale in his kitchen, kneading bread like she'd always been there. By the time he finished, fence mended, cattle rounded up and driven back, the sun had started its descent toward the horizon, painting everything in shades of amber and rust. Ethan rode home slowly, letting Flint pick his own pace, feeling every year of his 34 showing in the ache of his muscles and the grit behind his eyes. The house came into view just as dusk settled in, and something about seeing lamplight in the windows, warm and golden and welcoming, made his throat tight. He'd grown so accustomed to coming home to darkness, to the cold remnants of whatever meal he'd thrown together that morning. This felt different. This felt like someone was waiting. He unsaddled Flint, rubbed him down, measured out grain and fresh water. The barn cats emerged from their hiding places, winding around his boots and meowing for attention. He'd neglected them too, he realized, let everything slide while he focused on the impossible task of holding the ranch together single-handed. When he finally walked into the kitchen, the smell hit him first. Roast chicken, herbs, something sweet baking in the oven. Clara stood at the stove, her back to him, and for a moment Ethan just stood there, letting the warmth and light and scent wash over him like absolution. "You're late," Clara said without turning. "I was starting to worry." "Fence was worse than I thought. Took longer to fix." He pulled off his hat, ran a hand through sweat-damp hair. "Didn't mean to keep you waiting." "You didn't." She turned then, and her eyes went to his hands, the cuts, the dried blood, the raw places where wire had bitten deep. "Sit down. Let me see those." "They're fine." "They're not fine. Sit." The command in her voice surprised him enough that he obeyed, dropping into a chair while Clara pumped water into a basin and brought it to the table along with clean rags and a small bottle of something that smelled medicinal. "Give me your hands," she said quietly. Ethan hesitated, suddenly aware of how rough they were, calloused and scarred, the hands of a man who'd worked hard his whole life and had nothing but more work to show for it. But Clara was waiting, patient and unmovable, so he held them out. Her touch was gentle, but efficient as she cleaned the cuts, her fingers cool against his heated skin. She worked in silence, and Ethan found himself watching her face. The small furrow of concentration between her brows, the way she bit her lower lip slightly when dealing with a particularly deep gash, the surprising tenderness in the way she patted each wound dry before applying the stinging medicine. "You need gloves," she said finally, wrapping his right hand in clean bandaging. "Wire like that will tear you apart if you're not careful." "Had gloves. They wore through last month." "Then you need new ones." She started on his left hand, her movements practiced and sure. "Add it to the list of things we'll get in town." "I can't afford—" "You can't afford not to." Clara's eyes flicked up to meet his, and there was steel there beneath the softness. "You lose your hands. You lose everything. Even work gloves are cheaper than that." She was right, and they both knew it. Ethan nodded, watched her finish the bandaging, felt something shift in the air between them. Some wall lowered, some distance shortened. "Where'd you learn to do that?" he asked as she gathered up the soiled rags. "Tend wounds, I mean." "I was married to a carpenter." Clara's voice went flat, carefully neutral. "He came home cut or burned or bruised more often than not. I got good at patching him up." She paused, then added quietly, "For all the good it did." Ethan wanted to ask what that meant, how her husband had died, why there was such emptiness in her voice when she spoke of him. But Clara had already turned away, moving back to the stove, and the moment for questions had closed. "Dinner's almost ready," she said, her tone brightening with obvious effort. "Lily already ate. She's in our room, working on her letters. I hope you don't mind. I found some old paper and a pencil stub in one of the drawers." "Don't mind at all." Ethan flexed his bandaged hands, testing the wrapping. "Where'd you find a chicken? I haven't had one come in to roost in weeks. Found 3 in the hayloft, hiding up in the rafters. Convinced one of them to donate to the cause. A small smile played at the corner of Clara's mouth. The other 2 are back in the coop, and I fixed the latch that was letting them escape. You should get eggs regular now. You didn't have to do all that. I know. Clara set a plate before him. Roast chicken golden and glistening, potatoes with herbs, greens from somewhere he couldn't identify. But I did it anyway. That's what help means, Ethan. Not just doing the minimum, doing what needs doing. He picked up his fork, but before he could take a bite, Clara sat down across from him with her own plate. Smaller portions, but present. Sharing the meal instead of serving and retreating. It felt significant somehow, this simple act of eating together. Tell me about the ranch, she said after a moment. How long has it been in your family? 3 generations. Ethan cut into the chicken, watched steam rise. My grandfather won the land in a card game, or so the story goes. Built the house himself, married my grandmother, started running cattle. My father expanded it, brought it up to 600 acres. I was supposed to... He stopped, swallowed against the bitterness rising in his throat. I was supposed to make it even bigger, pass it on to my own children someday. That was the plan. What happened? The question was simple, but the answer was complicated. A tangle of bad luck, worse timing, and decisions that seemed right at the time, but revealed themselves as catastrophic in hindsight. I got ambitious, Ethan said finally. 5 years ago, cattle prices were high. I thought if I could expand the herd, take on more land, I could really make something of this place. So I borrowed money from the bank. A lot of money. Bought more cattle, hired more hands, pushed everything as far as it would go. And then? Then the drought came. 3 years of it. On and off. Lost half the herd the first year. Prices dropped because everyone was selling at once, trying to salvage what they could. The hands started leaving because I couldn't pay them regular. And the bank... He set down his fork, appetite suddenly gone. The bank's been patient, more patient than I deserve, but patience has limits. Clara was quiet for a long moment, her dark eyes steady on his face. When she spoke, her voice was gentle but unflinching. You're not going to save it, are you? The words should have hurt, should have felt like a knife between the ribs, but instead they brought an odd sense of relief. Someone else saying out loud what he'd known for months but couldn't bring himself to admit. Probably not, Ethan said quietly, but I'm not going down without fighting. I owe my father and grandfather that much. And maybe... He looked around the kitchen at the house that had sheltered 3 generations of Coles. Maybe if I can just hold on long enough to make one more good sale, I can walk away with something. Pay off the bank, have enough left to start over somewhere else. Is that what you want? To start over? No one had asked him that before. Everyone assumed he'd fight to the death to keep the ranch, that leaving would be the same as dying. But Clara's question suggested possibilities he hadn't let himself consider. I don't know, he admitted. This place is all I've ever known. Leaving feels like failure, like I'm betraying everyone who came before me. Or maybe it means you're smart enough to know when to walk away from a losing hand. Clara picked up her fork again, took a small bite of potato. My husband, John, he never learned that lesson. He kept pushing, kept working, kept trying to prove something even when it was killing him, literally killing him. He fell from a roof he had no business being on because he was too tired to see straight. But he wouldn't stop, wouldn't rest, wouldn't admit he was in over his head. Her voice had gone distant, and Ethan saw pain flash across her face, quick and sharp before she shuddered it away again. I'm sorry, he said, inadequate words for loss he couldn't measure. Don't be sorry. Just don't be stupid. Clara's eyes met his again, fierce now. Whatever you decide about this ranch, make sure it's a choice, not just stubbornness wearing you down to nothing. You're no good to anyone dead, Ethan Cole. Not to this land, not to the memory of your family, and not to yourself. The words landed hard, settling into places Ethan had tried not to examine too closely. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, to explain that quitting wasn't in his nature. But looking at Clara's face, seeing the grief and hard-won wisdom written there, he found he couldn't. They finished eating in silence, and when Clara rose to clear the plates, Ethan stood too. Let me help. She looked surprised but nodded, and they fell into an easy rhythm, him washing, her drying, passing dishes back and forth in the lamplight while the house settled around them with small creaks and sighs. It felt domestic in a way that should have been uncomfortable but somehow wasn't. Natural. Right. "Tell me about Lily," Ethan said as he scrubbed the roasting pan. "She hasn't said a word since you arrived." Clara's hand stilled on the dish towel. "She hasn't spoken since her father died. The doctor said it's shock, that she'll talk again when she's ready. But it's been 2 years, and I'm starting to wonder if she's forgotten how." "She understands what you say to her?" "Everything. She's bright, reads well for her age, knows her numbers, helps me with whatever I ask. She just—" Clara set down the dried plate, picked up another. "She just doesn't talk. I think maybe she's afraid that if she speaks, she'll say something that makes everything real. As long as she's quiet, she can pretend none of it happened." Ethan thought about that. About silence as protection, as a wall against reality too harsh to face. He'd been doing something similar himself, just without the excuse of childhood trauma. "Maybe she'll feel safe enough here," he said, surprising himself with the hope in his voice. "To speak again, I mean." Clara looked at him then, really looked at him, and something in her expression softened. Maybe. Or maybe she's just learned that silence is safer than words, that needing things from people only leads to disappointment. The observation hung between them, layered with meaning Ethan couldn't quite parse. Were they still talking about Lily? Or had the conversation shifted to something else entirely? To Clara herself? To him? To all the ways people learn to protect themselves from further hurt? Before he could respond, a sound came from Clara's room. Lily crying out in her sleep, a wordless sound of distress that cut through the quiet house like a blade. Clara dropped the towel and moved quickly, disappearing through the doorway. Ethan heard her voice, low and soothing, the murmur of comfort only a mother could provide. He stood alone in the kitchen, water dripping from his bandaged hands, feeling like an intruder in this moment of private pain. He dried his hands carefully, banked the stove, and turned down the lamps. By the time Clara emerged from her room, her face was composed again, but Ethan could see the exhaustion in the set of her shoulders. "She gets nightmares," Clara said quietly, as if feeling the need to explain. "Not every night, but often enough. I'm sorry if she disturbed you." "She didn't. I was still up anyway." Ethan hesitated, then asked, "Is she all right?" "She will be. She always is, eventually." Clara wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly looking very young and very tired. "It's just hard, watching her fight demons I can't see and can't protect her from." "You're doing the best you can. That's all anyone can do." "Is it enough, though?" The question came out raw, unguarded. "Is doing your best enough when it still leaves someone you love broken?" Ethan didn't have an answer for that. Not for her, not for himself. They stood there in the dim kitchen, two people carrying wounds that wouldn't heal, and the silence between them felt less like awkwardness and more like understanding. "Get some sleep," Ethan said finally. "Tomorrow's another day of work, and you'll need your strength." Clara nodded, started toward her room, then paused in the doorway. "Thank you, Ethan, for taking us in, for giving us a place to rest, even if it's temporary. You didn't have to do that." "Yeah, I did," he said quietly. "We all need help sometimes, even when we're too proud to ask for it." Something passed between them then. Recognition, perhaps, or simple human kindness. And then Clara was gone, the door closing softly behind her, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts and the ghost of her presence still warm in the air. He climbed the stairs to his room, exhausted but strangely unsettled, his mind full of Clara's words about choices and stubbornness and knowing when to walk away. He'd spent 3 years fighting to save something that might already be lost, pouring himself into land and cattle and legacy until he'd forgotten what it felt like to be anything other than desperate. But lying in the darkness, listening to the house breathe around him, Ethan found himself thinking not about the ranch or the bank or the weight of family history pressing down on his shoulders. Instead, he thought about a woman's gentle hands bandaging his wounds, about bread rising in the morning light, about the small mercies of shared meals and honest work. He thought about what it might mean to let someone help carry the burden, even if just for a little while. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that felt both strange and inevitable, like water finding its level after years of drought. Ethan rose before dawn, worked the land until his body screamed for rest, and returned each evening to find the house transformed, not just clean, but alive in ways he'd forgotten were possible. Clara moved through the rooms with quiet purpose, and though Lily remained silent, her presence became its own kind of conversation, her small shadow following her mother through chores and meals with solemn devotion. By the end of the first week, Ethan noticed the changes everywhere. The garden behind the house, which he'd let go fallow 2 years back, now showed neat rows of turned earth where Clara had planted late-season vegetables from seeds she'd brought in her trunk. The chicken coop had been scrubbed and reinforced, and the hens were laying regular now, producing more eggs than Ethan had seen in months. Even the barn cats looked healthier, their coats sleeker, their movements less desperate. It was the small things that undid him most. The way his shirts appeared on his bed, mended and clean, buttons replaced where they'd been missing. The jar of wildflowers on the kitchen table. Nothing fancy but bringing color to a space that had been gray for too long. The sound of humming, Clara's voice, low and melodic, drifting through the house as she worked. Filling silence that had grown so thick Ethan had forgotten what it felt like to breathe through it. On the 8th morning, he came down to find Clara at the table with a piece of paper and a pencil stub, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Making a list," she said without looking up. "Things we need from town. I've been stretching what you had in the pantry, but we're running low on flour, salt, coffee, and you need those gloves we talked about." Ethan poured himself coffee, studied the list over her shoulder. The items were practical, necessary, but seeing them written out in Clara's neat hand made the weight of his situation press heavier. He couldn't afford half of what she'd listed, not without dipping into the small reserve he'd been hoarding for the bank. "We can make do with less," he said carefully. "Skip the coffee. I can go without." Clara's pencil stilled. "You drink 4 cups before noon, Ethan. You need it." "Needs a strong word." "Fine. You'll be miserable without it, and miserable men make poor decisions." She looked up at him then, and there was something almost amused in her eyes. "Besides, I already budgeted for it. I'm not asking you to buy luxuries, just what's necessary to keep this place running." "And where exactly did this budget come from?" Clara set down the pencil, folded her hands on the table. "I had some money saved. Not much, but enough to help with supplies for a few weeks. Consider it payment for room and board." "Absolutely not." Ethan's voice came out sharper than he intended. "You're working for your keep. I'm not taking your money on top of that." "You're not taking it. I'm spending it." Clara's tone remained calm, but there was steel underneath. "On food we'll both eat, supplies we'll both use. Don't make this about pride, Ethan. That's a luxury neither of us can afford." They stared at each other across the table, wills locked in silent battle. Ethan wanted to argue, to refuse, to maintain some semblance of being the provider rather than another mouth being fed by a widow's charity. But Clara's expression was implacable, and beneath his pride he knew she was right. "Fine," he said finally, the word tasting like defeat, "but I'm paying you back. When the fall sale comes through, every penny you spend gets returned." "If the fall sale comes through," Clara corrected gently. "And if it does, we'll discuss it then. For now, I need you to hitch up the wagon. Town's 8 miles, and I want to get there and back before the heat gets too bad. I'll drive you." "You have fencing to repair on the east quarter. You said so yourself last night." "The fencing can wait." "No, it can't." Clara stood, gathering the list and tucking it into her apron pocket. "And I'm perfectly capable of driving myself and Lily to town. I've done it before, and I'll do it again. You need to trust me, Ethan. That's part of what help means." The words from their first night echoed back at him. Not just doing the minimum, doing what needs doing. And Ethan felt the same uncomfortable mix of gratitude and inadequacy that had been his constant companion since Clara arrived. "Town's not always friendly to strangers," he said quietly, "especially women traveling alone. And if they know you're staying here, working for me." He didn't finish the sentence, but Clara's expression told him she understood. "Let me guess. A widowed woman living under a bachelor's roof will set tongues wagging." "Something like that." Clara's laugh was short and bitter. "Ethan, tongues have been wagging about me since the day John died, and I had the audacity to keep living. I'm used to judgment. It doesn't scare me anymore." but there was something in her voice, a hairline crack in the armor, that suggested judgment still hurt, even if she'd learned to bear it. Ethan recognized it because he carried the same fracture himself, the weight of falling short of what people expected. "I'll hitch up the wagon," he said, surrendering the argument if not his misgivings. "But you take Flint too. Tie him to the back. If the mare throws a shoe or goes lame, you'll need another way home." Clara nodded, something like relief crossing her face. "Thank you." An hour later, Ethan stood in the yard watching the wagon roll down the long drive. Clara at the reins and Lily beside her, the child's small face turned back to look at him until they disappeared over the first rise. The ranch felt emptier for their absence, not the familiar emptiness he'd grown accustomed to, but something rawer, more acute, like he'd gotten used to not being alone, and now the solitude chafed in ways it hadn't before. He forced himself to work, riding out to the east quarter where fence line ran along the creek. The damage here was different from the north, not wind and rot, but deliberately cut wire, probably by rustlers trying to move stolen cattle across property lines. The discovery made his jaw tight and his hands shake with anger he couldn't afford to indulge. He was splicing wire, sweat running down his back and soaking through his shirt, when he heard hoofbeats approaching. Ethan straightened, hand going instinctively to the rifle in his saddle scabbard, then relaxed fractionally when he recognized the rider. James McKendrick owned the spread to the east, twice the size of Ethan's, and 3 times as profitable. He was 10 years older, with silver threading through his dark hair and the kind of weathered confidence that came from never having known real failure. They'd been friendly once, back before Ethan's situation became common knowledge. Now McKendrick's visits felt less like neighborly courtesy and more like a vulture circling. "Cole." McKendrick reined in his bay gelding, looked down at Ethan with something between pity and calculation. "Heard you had someone new staying at your place." Word traveled fast. Ethan kept his expression neutral, went back to splicing wire. "That's right. Widow and her daughter. They're helping out in exchange for room and board." "Helping out?" McKendrick repeated the words like they tasted odd. "That what they're calling it these days?" Ethan's hands stilled on the wire, and when he looked up, his eyes were cold. "Say what you came to say, James. I've got work to do." McKendrick had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "Look, I'm not judging. Hell, if I were in your position, alone out here, facing what you're facing, I might make the same choice. But people in town are talking, and I figured you should know before it gets ugly. People always talk, doesn't make what they're saying true." "Maybe not." McKendrick shifted in his saddle, leather creaking. "But true or not, reputation matters, especially when you're trying to convince the bank to give you more time. Harrison's a church-going man, Cole. He hears you're keeping a woman out here, no chaperone, no propriety. It's not going to help your case." The words landed like blows, each one calculated to hurt. Ethan forced himself to breathe slowly, to keep his voice level. "Mrs. Hale is my employee, that's all. Anyone who suggests otherwise is a liar and a gossip, and you can tell them I said so." "I believe you." McKendrick's tone suggested he didn't, not really. "But belief's got nothing to do with how things look, and right now it looks like you're desperate enough to compromise a widow's reputation for your own convenience." "Is that what you think?" "I think you're drowning, and you grabbed onto whatever lifeline floated by." McKendrick's voice softened slightly. "I also think my offer still stands. You want to sell before the bank forecloses, I'll give you a fair price. Enough to walk away clean, start fresh somewhere else. You could take that widow and her daughter with you, do right by them, somewhere people don't know your history." The offer hung in the air between them, tempting and poisonous in equal measure. Ethan had refused it twice before, but hearing it now, with Clara and Lily already woven into the fabric of his days, with the house finally feeling like something other than a tomb, the temptation cut deeper. "Not interested," Ethan said, turning back to his work. "Ranch isn't for sale." "It will be, whether you want it or not. I'm just trying to give you a choice in the matter." McKendrick gathered his reins. "Think about it, Cole. Think about what happens to that woman and her girl when this place goes under and you've got nothing left to offer them. Pride's expensive. Make sure you can afford the cost. He rode off before Ethan could respond, leaving only dust and implications hanging in the hot afternoon air. Ethan stood there, wire cutters in his bandaged hands, and felt the weight of every word settle into his bones like poison. By the time he finished the fence repair and rode back to the house, the sun had tipped past noon and was sliding toward the western horizon. The wagon sat in the yard, supplies unloaded, but there was no sign of Clara or Lily. Ethan found them in the garden, Clara on her knees in the dirt while Lily carefully placed seeds in the furrows her mother had dug. Clara looked up when his shadow fell across her, and Ethan saw immediately that something was wrong. Her face was composed, but her eyes held the same careful blankness he recognized from that first day, the look of someone who'd been hurt and was trying not to show it. "How was town?" he asked, keeping his voice neutral. "Fine." Clara returned her attention to the seeds, movements precise and controlled. "We got everything on the list. I put it away already." "Clara, I said it was fine, Ethan." She didn't look up, but her voice carried an edge that cut. "We went to town, we got supplies, we came home. Nothing happened worth discussing." But something had happened. Ethan could see it in the rigid set of her shoulders, in the way Lily pressed closer to her mother's side, in the deliberate focus Clara was giving to work that didn't require such intensity. He crouched down beside her, ignoring the protest of his tired muscles. "What did they say to you?" "Who?" "Whoever it was that put that look on your face. What did they say?" Clara's hand stilled in the dirt. For a long moment, she didn't answer, and Ethan thought maybe she wouldn't. Then she sat back on her heels, wiped her hands on her apron, and met his eyes with something like defiance. "The grocer's wife saw us loading supplies, asked where I was staying. When I told her, she got this look." Clara's voice went flat. "This knowing, judging look. Said it was mighty convenient, me landing here just when you needed help. Said she wondered what kind of help exactly I was providing." Anger flared hot in Ethan's chest. She had no right. She had every right to think what everyone else is thinking. Clara's voice rose slightly, control slipping. "A widow and a bachelor, living under the same roof with no family to vouch for us, no propriety to protect us. Of course people are going to talk. Of course they're going to assume the worst. That's what people do. Then they're wrong, and they can go to hell. Being wrong doesn't stop them from talking. And their talk can hurt you, Ethan. With the bank, with potential buyers, with anyone you might need on your side to save this place." Clara pushed herself to her feet, dirt streaking her dress. Maybe McKendrick was right. Maybe this was a mistake. The name hit Ethan like a fist. "McKendrick came to see you?" "He was leaving the mercantile when we arrived. Very polite, very concerned. Told me he hoped I knew what I was getting into, staying at a failing ranch with a man who couldn't protect my reputation." Clara's laugh was sharp and humorless, as if my reputation is something I still have to lose. Ethan stood too, close enough now that he could see the shimmer of tears Clara was fighting to hold back. "I'm sorry. I should have warned you better. Should have prepared you for what? For people being exactly who they've always been?" She shook her head. "I knew what this would look like. Her voice cracked slightly. "I just forgot how much it hurts, being looked at like you're something shameful, something dirty. I'd gotten good at being invisible these past 2 years. This feels like being seen in the worst possible way." Without thinking, Ethan reached out and took her hand, the one still streaked with garden dirt, nails broken from work, knuckles red from water and lye soap. It was a worker's hand, honest and strong, and the fact that anyone would look at this woman and see something sordid made him want to ride into town and start breaking things. "You're not shameful," he said quietly, fiercely. "You're not dirty. You're a woman doing honest work to take care of her child, and anyone who can't see that is blind and stupid and not worth your time." Clara looked down at their joined hands, and when she spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. "You're going to lose everything because of me. The bank, the town, everyone who matters, they're all going to turn against you because I'm here. Let them." The words came out before Ethan could stop them, raw and true. "Let them all turn. I was losing everything anyway, Clara. At least this way, I'm losing it while eating real food and coming home to a house that doesn't feel like a grave. That's worth more than their good opinion." Something shifted in Claire's expression. Surprise, maybe, or recognition, or something deeper that Ethan couldn't name. Her fingers tightened around his, just for a moment, and then she pulled away, turning back to Lily, who had been watching them both with those wide, solemn eyes. "Come on, sweetheart," Clara said softly, holding out her hand to her daughter. "Let's go start supper. Mr. Cole's had a long day." Ethan wanted to call her back, to say something more, but the moment had passed and Clara was already walking toward the house, Lily's small hand in hers. He stood alone in the garden, surrounded by the growing things they'd planted together, and felt the future narrowing around him like a noose. That evening, they ate in near silence, the easy rhythm of previous nights fractured by the weight of what had been said and unsaid. Lily picked at her food, sensing the tension, and Claire's face remained carefully neutral. Only when Ethan stood to clear the dishes did she finally speak. "I think Lily and I should leave soon. Before the talk gets worse, before it costs you more than you can afford to pay." The words dropped like stones into still water, rippling outward. Ethan set down the plates he'd been holding. "No." "Ethan, I said no." He turned to face her fully. "You made a deal. 3 months of work in exchange for room and board. I'm holding you to it. Even if it ruins you?" "I'm already ruined, Clara. The only question is whether I go down fighting or whether I roll over and let them win." He moved back to the table, placed both hands flat on the scarred wood. "You staying or leaving isn't going to change what happens to the ranch. But it might change what happens to you and Lily. Where will you go if you leave here? What work will you find? How long before you're desperate again, taking another job with another stranger who might not be as decent as I'm trying to be?" Clara flinched at that, and Ethan immediately regretted the harshness of it. But he didn't take it back because it was true, and truth was all they had left between them. "I don't want your pity," Clara said quietly. "Good, because I'm not offering it." Ethan softened his voice. "I'm offering you exactly what you asked for. A place to work, a place to rest, a few months of stability before you have to move on. Don't let small-minded gossips take that away from you. From either of us." Clara studied his face for a long moment, searching for something Ethan couldn't name. Whatever she found there must have satisfied her because she nodded slowly. "All right, we'll stay. For now." "For now," Ethan agreed, even though part of him wanted to demand more, wanted to ask what would make her stay longer, wanted to examine the strange ache in his chest at the thought of this house going back to being empty. Later, after Clara and Lily had retreated to their room and Ethan lay in his bed upstairs listening to the house settle, he found himself thinking about McKendrick's offer, about walking away clean, starting fresh, maybe taking Clara and Lily somewhere they could all begin again without the weight of judgment and failing ranches and reputation-destroying gossip. It was a pretty fantasy, but that's all it was. Even if he sold, even if he walked away, he'd just be running from the same basic truth that had defined his whole life. He was good at losing things. Good at fighting for them, too, but better at losing. His parents, his ambitions, his future. And now, maybe, his last chance at something resembling dignity. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows, and Ethan closed his eyes against thoughts that circled like vultures. Tomorrow would bring more work, more struggle, more small battles in a war he was slowly losing. But tonight, the house was warm, and somewhere below him Clara and Lily slept in safety, and for a few stolen hours, that would have to be enough. He was drifting toward sleep when he heard it, a distant crackling sound, almost like rain on a tin roof. But the sky had been clear at sunset, and this sound was wrong somehow, too sharp, too irregular. Ethan sat up, every instinct suddenly screaming alarm. Smoke. He could smell it now, acrid and thick, drifting through the gaps in the window frame. He was out of bed and down the stairs before conscious thought caught up with movement, his bare feet hitting the floorboards hard. The kitchen was dark, but there was an orange glow visible through the windows. Not close, not yet, but getting closer with terrifying speed. "Clara!" He pounded on her door. "Clara, wake up! Fire!" The door flew open, Clara standing there in her nightgown, hair loose around her shoulders, eyes wide with instant alertness. "Where?" "North Field, moving this way. The wind's driving it fast." Ethan was already moving, grabbing his boots, pulling them on. We need to get the horses and cattle moved, need to wet down the buildings. We don't have much time. Clara was gone before he finished speaking, calling for Lily, her voice urgent but controlled. When she emerged moments later, she'd thrown a dress over her nightgown and was pulling on her boots, Lily clinging to her hand. "What do you need me to do?" Clara asked. Ethan looked at her, at this woman who'd been here barely a week, who owed him nothing, who had every reason to grab her daughter and run, and saw only fierce determination in her face. "Can you handle the pump? Fill every bucket we have, soak down the house and barn?" "Yes." "Then do that. Keep Lily with you. Stay close to the house. If the fire gets too close, if it jumps the fire break, you take Lily and you run. Don't wait for me. Don't try to save anything. Just run." "Ethan, promise me, Clara." Their eyes locked, and in that moment, with smoke thickening the air and the distant roar of flames growing louder, something passed between them that felt like a vow. "I promise," Clara said. "But you'd better come back, Ethan Cole. You hear me? You'd better come back." He wanted to answer, wanted to make promises he couldn't keep, but there wasn't time. The fire was coming, hungry and relentless, and everything they'd been building together, fragile and imperfect as it was, stood directly in its path. Ethan ran. The night air that had been cool hours before now felt scorched, carrying ash and embers like malevolent snow. He could see the fire clearly now, a wall of orange and red consuming the north field, advancing with terrifying speed toward the buildings. The wind drove it forward in hungry surges, and each gust sent sparks spiraling into the darkness like demonic fireflies seeking new places to burn. Behind him, he heard the frantic working of the pump, the splash of water into buckets, Clara's voice calm and steady as she directed Lily. But Ethan couldn't look back. Every second counted now, and looking back meant losing seconds they didn't have. The barn first. The horses were already screaming, their primal fear of fire overriding years of training. Ethan threw open the main doors, smoke immediately stinging his eyes and throat. Inside was chaos, Flint rearing in his stall, the wagon mare kicking at her gate. The other two horses he kept for working cattle spinning and calling out in panic. "Easy, easy," Ethan called, knowing the words were useless, but needing to say something, anything, to cut through their terror. He grabbed a lead rope, forced himself to move deliberately despite every instinct screaming to hurry. Flint's eyes showed white all around, nostrils flaring, but when Ethan reached for his halter, years of trust won out over fear. The gelding let himself be caught, and Ethan led him out into the yard where Clara had already soaked the ground around the house. "Take him to the creek," Ethan shouted over the rising roar of the flames. "Get him across to the far bank." Clara appeared out of the smoke-hazed darkness, took Flint's rope without hesitation, and led the terrified horse toward the water. Ethan turned back to the barn, back into the smoke that was getting thicker with each passing moment. The wagon mare came next, then the other two horses, each one requiring precious minutes of coaxing and force to get them out, to get them to safety. By the time he'd moved the last horse, the fire had reached the north fence line. Ethan could feel its heat now, could hear the terrible sound of destruction, crackling and whooshing, and the deep underlying roar that sounded almost alive. He ran for the cattle, scattered across the nearer pastures, already running in panic, but not coherently, not away from the danger, but in aimless, terrified circles. He had no rope, no time to round them properly. All he could do was ride between them and the flames, shouting and waving his arms, trying to drive them toward the creek where the water might save them. Some listened to instinct and ran. Others froze or scattered the wrong direction, and Ethan had to make split-second calculations about which ones he could save and which ones were already lost. The smoke was everywhere now, burning his lungs, making his eyes stream. He tied a bandana over his nose and mouth, but it did little to filter out the suffocating thickness. He could barely see, could barely breathe, but he kept moving, kept driving cattle toward water, kept fighting because stopping meant surrender, and surrender meant losing everything. A section of fence exploded into flame to his right, so close the heat seared his exposed skin. Flint, he was back on Flint somehow, couldn't remember mounting but must have, shied violently, nearly throwing him. Ethan clung to the saddle, got the horse under control, wheeled him around to find more cattle to move. That's when he saw her. "Clara, running toward the barn with a bucket in each hand, her dress soaked through and clinging to her legs, her face streaked with ash and sweat. She'd sent Lily somewhere safe. Ethan hoped to God she'd sent Lily somewhere safe. And now she was doing exactly what he'd told her to do, soaking down the buildings, trying to save what could be saved. But she was going the wrong direction. Moving toward the barn when she should have been moving away, toward safety, toward the creek. And behind her, a wall of flame was racing across the dry grass of the paddock, faster than any person could run, consuming everything in its path with savage efficiency. "Clara!" Ethan's scream tore his already raw throat. "Clara, run!" She didn't hear him. The fire was too loud, and she was too focused on reaching the barn, on doing what needed to be done. Ethan drove his heels into Flint's sides, and the horse responded despite his terror, lunging forward in a gallop that ate up the distance between them. But the fire was faster. It reached the barn first, climbing the old dry wood with gleeful speed, racing up the walls to the roof in seconds. Clara skidded to a stop, dropping the buckets, and for one terrible moment she just stood there, frozen in the face of destruction too vast to fight with water and determination. Then the wind shifted, and a gust of superheated air knocked her backward, stumbling. She caught herself, tried to run, but her wet dress tangled around her legs and she went down hard, hitting the ground just as a section of burning roof broke free and began to fall directly toward where she lay. Ethan didn't think. Thinking would have paralyzed him, would have forced him to calculate odds and distances and the impossibility of what he was attempting. He just moved, drove Flint straight into the heat and smoke and danger, leaned down from the saddle and grabbed Clara's arm with both hands, hauling her up with strength born of pure, desperate fear. She came up off the ground, her weight nearly pulling him from the saddle, but he held on, got her across Flint's withers, and then they were moving again, the horse's hooves pounding against earth that was already scorched and smoking. Behind them, the barn roof collapsed with a sound like thunder, sending a column of sparks and embers exploding into the night sky. They reached the creek and Flint plunged in without being asked, the cool water rising to his knees, then his belly. Ethan let go and Clara slid down into the water, gasping, coughing, her hands coming up to grip Flint's mane for balance. Around them, cattle stood in the shallows, their eyes still wild but their bodies safe for the moment, protected by the creek that was too wide for the fire to easily jump. "Lily!" Clara gasped, water and tears streaming down her face. "Where's Lily?" "You tell me. I told you to take her somewhere safe." "The root cellar. I put her in the root cellar with the door closed." "She should be." Clara tried to move back toward the bank, toward the house that was now barely visible through the smoke. "I have to get to her." Ethan grabbed her arm, held her in place. "You can't. The fire's between us and the house now. We have to wait for it to pass." "She's alone. She's terrified. You have to trust that the cellar will protect her." Ethan's voice was rough, but his grip on Clara's arm was gentle. "It's underground, stone-lined, with a heavy door. The fire can't reach her there. But if you try to go back now, you'll die. And then what happens to her?" Clara made a sound that was half sob, half scream, her whole body shaking with the need to go to her daughter and the knowledge that Ethan was right. She sank down in the water until it reached her chest, and Ethan stayed beside her, one hand still on Flint's reins, the other moving to Clara's shoulder because she looked like she might shatter into pieces if someone didn't hold her together. They watched the fire consume everything. The barn went completely, collapsing into itself in stages, each fall sending more sparks skyward. The pasture grass burned fast and hot, leaving nothing but blackened earth in its wake. The chicken coop erupted into flame, and Ethan hoped the hens had sense enough to run, though he knew most of them were probably already lost. Even the garden, Clara's garden, planted with such care, disappeared under the advancing flames, all those small, growing things reduced to ash in minutes. But the house stood. Soaked by Clara's work with the pump, surrounded by the cleared dirt of the yard, it stood. Smoke darkened, windows broken from the heat, but standing. And somewhere beneath it, in a stone cellar that had sheltered 3 generations of Coles through storms and troubles, a small girl waited for her mother to come back. The fire burned for hours. They stayed in the creek, occasionally moving the cattle when they tried to drift back toward the burned land, watching as flame moved across the ranch like a living thing with appetite and malice. Other ranchers appeared around midnight, neighbors drawn by the glow visible for miles, coming with wagons full of water barrels and willing hands to fight what could still be fought. James McKendrick was among them, and the look on his face when he saw Ethan and Clara in the creek together, soaked and exhausted, Ethan's hand still on her shoulder, spoke volumes about assumptions and judgments that would follow this night. But for once, Ethan didn't care. Let them think what they wanted. Clara was alive, and that mattered more than reputation. By the time the fire finally exhausted itself, pushed back by the creek on one side and the desperate efforts of the neighbors on the other, dawn was breaking gray and ashen over the scorched land. Ethan's entire body ached. His hands were blistered beneath the bandages Clara had applied days before, and his throat felt like he'd swallowed glass. But he was alive, and Clara was alive, and when they finally climbed out of the creek and stumbled toward the house, he could think of nothing but getting to that cellar, getting to Lily, proving that his promise to keep them safe hadn't been one more thing he'd failed at. Clara ran ahead of him, her wet clothes heavy and dragging, but moving with a mother's desperate speed. She reached the cellar door, barely visible under a coating of ash, and hauled it open, disappearing down the stone steps into darkness. Ethan followed more slowly, his exhausted body protesting every movement. He could hear Clara's voice below, calling Lily's name, the words breaking with relief and residual fear. When he reached the bottom of the steps, he found them in a corner, Clara on her knees, Lily wrapped in her arms, the child's face buried against her mother's shoulder. And for the first time since Ethan had met her, Lily was making sound. Not words yet, but small hiccuping sobs, the kind of crying that came from terror survived and safety found. Clara was crying too, rocking her daughter, murmuring reassurances that came out fractured and breathless. Ethan stood in the doorway, suddenly feeling like an intruder in this moment of raw maternal grief and relief. But Clara looked up, and when their eyes met, something passed between them that went beyond words or explanations. They had survived. Together, they had faced the fire and survived. "Come here," Clara said quietly, one hand reaching toward him. Ethan crossed the small space and knelt beside them, and Clara's hand found his, squeezing once, hard. They stayed that way for a long moment, three people in a dark cellar beneath a smoke-damaged house, holding on to each other while above them the first full light of day revealed the extent of the destruction. When they finally climbed out, the devastation was worse than Ethan had imagined. The barn was gone entirely, just a smoking skeleton of charred timber. The bunkhouse had burned. The chicken coop, the tool shed, every outbuilding except the house itself had been consumed. The pastures were black and lifeless, and the cattle that remained, maybe 100 head out of the original 200, stood scattered and shell-shocked in the creek bottom. The neighbors had saved what they could, but now they stood in awkward silence, looking at Ethan with expressions ranging from pity to calculation. McKendrick approached first, his face grave. "Cole, I'm sorry. This is—" He stopped, seemed to realize there were no words adequate for this level of loss. "What are you going to do?" Ethan looked around at the ruins of everything 3 generations had built. He thought about the bank letter still sitting on his kitchen table, about the impossible deadline that had been difficult before and was now completely insurmountable. He thought about the small amount of money Clara had spent on supplies yesterday, money that should have gone toward rebuilding but was now just another loss in a ledger full of losses. He thought about giving up, about taking McKendrick's offer, walking away, letting the fire be the final word on the Cole ranch. Then he felt Clara's hand slip into his again, and when he looked down, Lily was there too, her small hand gripping his pants leg, her face tilted up toward his with those wide, solemn eyes that had seen too much in her short life. Neither of them said anything, couldn't say anything in Lily's case, but their presence was its own kind of answer. "I'm going to rebuild," Ethan heard himself say, the words sounding insane even as he spoke them. Not everything, not like it was, but enough to get through fall sale with what cattle are left, enough to settle with the bank one way or another. "Ethan," McKendrick said carefully, "be reasonable. You've lost more than half your herd, all your outbuildings, most of your fencing. Even if you sell everything that's left, you won't have enough to pay off the mortgage. And winter's coming. How are you going to— I don't know, Ethan interrupted, his voice flat and final. But I'm going to try. That's all I can do. Try. McKendrick looked at Clara then, something knowing and ugly passing across his face. And what about her? What about these two when you fail and there's nothing left? You planning to drag them down with you? Clara's back straightened, and when she spoke, her voice was steel-wrapped in smoke-damaged velvet. Mr. McKendrick, I appreciate your concern, but I'm capable of making my own decisions about who I stand with. Ethan gave me and my daughter shelter when we needed it. Now he needs help rebuilding. I intend to provide it. Even though standing with him will ruin what's left of your reputation? My reputation was ruined the day my husband died, and I had the audacity to keep living. Clara's smile was sharp as broken glass. At least this time, I'll have earned it. The other neighbors were watching now, this confrontation becoming the story they'd take back to town. The desperate rancher, the widow who wouldn't leave, the impropriety of it all playing out in ash and smoke. Ethan knew he should care more, should feel the weight of judgment and shame that McKendrick was trying to heap on them both. But all he felt was a strange kind of clarity, like the fire had burned away everything except what was essential. Clara was staying. She was choosing to stay, choosing to help, choosing him over the easier path of leaving. And that choice, freely made, eyes open to the cost, meant more than any banker's approval or neighbor's good opinion. Thank you for your help tonight, Ethan said to McKendrick, to all of them. I'm grateful, but we can take it from here. It was a dismissal, and they knew it. Slowly they mounted up or climbed into wagons, their expressions ranging from disapproval to pity to something like reluctant respect. McKendrick was last to leave, pausing with one foot in his stirrup to look back at Ethan. You're a fool, Cole, but I suppose there's a certain dignity in it. He swung into the saddle. My offer stands. When you're ready to be sensible, you know where to find me. Then he was gone, and Ethan was left standing in the ruins of his life with a widow and her silent daughter, the morning sun rising over blackened land, and absolutely no idea how they were going to survive what came next. Clara moved first, releasing his hand to push hair back from her face, leaving ash streaks across her cheekbone. We should inventory what's left, figure out what we need most urgently. Clara, you don't have to. I know I don't have to. She looked at him directly, her dark eyes still red-rimmed from smoke and tears, but utterly clear. I'm choosing to. There's a difference. Why? The question came out raw, desperate. Why would you choose this? You could leave right now, take Lily somewhere safe, find work somewhere that isn't actively falling apart. Why would you stay? Claire was quiet for a moment, and when she finally answered, her voice was soft but certain. Because for the first time in 2 years, I feel like I'm building something instead of just running from what I lost. Because Lily sleeps better here than she has anywhere else we've been. Because— She stopped, swallowed hard. Because last night, you rode through fire to save me when you could have saved yourself. And I need to know what kind of world it is where people do things like that. I need to believe it's a world worth staying in. The words settled into Ethan's chest, warm and terrifying. He wanted to tell her she was wrong, that he wasn't heroic, that he had acted on instinct and fear rather than any kind of nobility. He wanted to warn her that staying would hurt, that he would disappoint her the way he disappointed everyone else who'd ever depended on him. But before he could speak, Lily tugged on his pants leg again. When Ethan looked down, the girl was holding something out to him. A single wildflower. Somehow preserved in the cellar, its petals still bright yellow against the gray ash that covered everything else. Lily pressed the flower into his hand, and though she still didn't speak, her eyes said everything that words couldn't. Hope. Trust. The belief that something beautiful could survive even through fire. Ethan closed his fingers carefully around the fragile stem, and for the first time since the fire started, he felt something other than desperation and dread. It wasn't quite hope. He wasn't ready for that yet. But it was something close, something that whispered maybe, against all odds, they could actually do this. All right, he said quietly, looking from the flower to Clara to the ruins around them. Let's figure out what we need first. They spent the rest of the morning taking stock of the damage. The house had survived, though it would need repairs. The well was intact, which meant they had water. The root cellar had protected their stores of preserved food, and the 100 head of cattle that remained, while far fewer than they'd started with, were still enough to work with if they could keep them fed and safe until fall. What they'd lost was almost everything else: tools, tack, feed stores, fencing materials. The wagon had burned in the barn along with most of their equipment. Ethan's saddle had survived only because it had been hanging in the house, and Clara's few possessions were safe because they'd been in her room. It should have been devastating. It was devastating. But standing in the ruins with Clara methodically listing what they had versus what they needed, Ethan found that the crushing weight of hopelessness he'd carried for 3 years had shifted somehow. It was still there. He wasn't fool enough to think one night of survival had fixed everything. But it felt different now, shared. "We can't afford to replace everything," Clara said, her practical voice cutting through his thoughts. "So we need to prioritize. Fencing first to keep the cattle contained, then basic tools. Everything else can wait." "We can't afford to replace anything," Ethan corrected gently. "What little money I had left was supposed to go to the bank. After this," he gestured at the destruction, "they'll probably foreclose immediately. No point waiting for fall sale when there's nothing left to sell." "Then we'll write to them, explain what happened, ask for an extension." "Clara, banks don't give extensions out of the goodness of their hearts." "No, but they do prefer to avoid complete losses." Clara's eyes were sharp, calculating. "Right now, you have land and surviving cattle. If they foreclose immediately, they get a fire-damaged ranch that will take months to sell and won't bring full value. If they wait, give you until fall sale, they might actually get their money back. It's a business decision, Ethan. Help them see that it's in their best interest to wait." It was logical, even compelling. But Ethan had spent 3 years watching logic fail against the reality of debt and bad luck. Still, Clara was looking at him with such fierce determination that he found himself nodding. "I'll write to Harrison today, but don't get your hopes up. Even if he agrees to wait, we still have to make fall sale work with half the herd and no buildings." "Then that's what we'll do." Clara straightened, brushing ash from her ruined dress. "But first I'm going to cook us breakfast. We're all exhausted and hungry, and nothing good ever came from making plans on an empty stomach." She turned toward the house, Lily trailing behind her, and Ethan watched them go, this widow and her silent daughter who'd appeared like Providence and stayed despite every reason to run. He looked down at the wildflower still clutched in his bandaged hand, its bright petals absurdly cheerful against the backdrop of ash and destruction. Then he followed them inside, toward whatever came next, toward the impossible work of rebuilding from ashes, toward a future that looked nothing like what he'd planned, but somehow, impossibly, felt less like ending and more like beginning. The letter to Mr. Harrison at Cheyenne Savings and Loan took Ethan 3 attempts to write. The first was too desperate, the second too proud, and the third, composed at the kitchen table while Clara kneaded bread and Lily carefully copied her letters on salvaged paper, finally struck the balance between honesty and hope that might, against all odds, convince a banker to bet on a burned ranch and a man who'd already lost almost everything. He rode into town 2 days after the fire, his body still aching from burns and exhaustion, to post the letter and face whatever judgment awaited him. The looks he received were exactly what he'd expected: curiosity mixed with pity, speculation about Clara wrapped in thin veils of concern. Mrs. Henderson at the post office took his letter with pursed lips and a comment about how Providence worked in mysterious ways, which Ethan took to mean she'd already heard every detail of the fire and his improper living arrangement. He bought what supplies they could afford with the last of his cash: fence wire, nails, a pair of work gloves that weren't quite the right size but would have to do, and rode home before anyone could corner him with questions or offers that were really just curiosity dressed up as charity. When he crested the last rise and saw the ranch spread out below, the devastation still took his breath. Even knowing what to expect, seeing it in full daylight was like taking a fist to the gut. But there was movement too. Clara in the garden, turning over the burned earth, searching for anything that might have survived. And near the ruins of the barn, someone had stacked the salvageable lumber, organized the scattered tools, created order from chaos. Clara looked up as he approached, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun. Her dress was still stained with ash, her hair tied back with a strip of cloth, and she'd never looked more beautiful to him, strong and real, and utterly present in the wreckage of his life. "Any luck?" she called. "Posted the letter. Harrison should have it by tomorrow." Ethan dismounted, began unloading supplies. "Don't know if it'll make a difference, but at least we tried." "That's all we can do." Clara wiped dirt from her hands. "I found some potato plants that survived. The roots were deep enough that the fire didn't reach them. We'll have something to harvest in a few weeks, if we're careful." Such a small thing, a few potato plants, but the way Clara said it made it sound like treasure. And maybe it was. Maybe survival was just a series of small treasures strung together, each one proof that something could endure even through fire. The days that followed settled into a rhythm defined by exhaustion and incremental progress. Ethan worked from before dawn until well after dark, repairing fence with salvaged wire, building temporary shelters for the cattle using charred lumber and sheer stubborn will. His hands bled through the new gloves, his back screamed protest, and every night he fell into bed so tired he couldn't think, couldn't worry, could only sleep the dreamless sleep of someone who'd pushed themselves beyond all reasonable limits. Clara worked beside him when she could, and alone when she couldn't. She cooked meals that stretched their limited supplies into something nourishing. She tended his burns and blisters with steady hands. She planted seeds in blackened earth and spoke to them like they were children who needed encouragement to grow. And somehow, impossibly, things did grow. Small green shoots pushing up through ash, declaring that life was stubborn and refusing to be finished just because fire said it should be. Lily remained silent, but her presence became its own kind of communication. She followed them through their work, handing tools before they were asked for, fetching water without being told, her small hands helping in whatever ways they could. And sometimes, when the work was particularly hard, or the situation particularly grim, she would appear beside Ethan and slip her hand into his, just holding on, and that simple gesture gave him strength to keep going when logic said he should quit. 2 weeks after the fire, the response from Harrison arrived. Ethan stood in the yard holding the envelope, afraid to open it, afraid of what final judgment it might contain. Clara came to stand beside him, and without being asked, she took his hand. "Whatever it says, we'll face it," she said quietly. Ethan nodded, broke the seal, and read words that felt like resurrection. Harrison was granting an extension, not out of kindness, but exactly as Clara had predicted, out of cold business calculation that waiting might recover more of the bank's investment than immediate foreclosure. The deadline was pushed to November, after the fall cattle sale. If Ethan could pay at least half the outstanding mortgage by then, Harrison would restructure the remaining debt into manageable terms. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't even mercy, but it was a chance which was more than Ethan had dared hope for. "We have until November," he said, his voice rough with emotions he couldn't name. 4 months to make this work." Clara's hand tightened on his. "Then we'd better get busy." They worked harder than before, if that was possible. Neighbors who'd helped fight the fire came back with unsolicited gifts, lumber, feed, even a few chickens to replace the ones lost. Some came with judgment still written on their faces. But they came anyway, bound by the Western code that said, you helped your neighbors survive even if you didn't approve of how they chose to live. Tommy Preston showed up one morning with his father, both of them carrying tools and wearing work clothes. "Heard you could use some help with the fencing," Tommy said, his young face serious. "Pa said we could spare a few days." Ethan wanted to refuse, wanted to maintain some shred of independence, but Clara caught his eye and shook her head slightly. Pride was expensive, and they couldn't afford it. So he accepted, and for 3 days the Prestons worked alongside him, mending fence and asking no questions about Clara or propriety or any of the things the town was surely saying. On the 3rd day, as they were finishing up, Mr. Preston pulled Ethan aside. "My wife wants me to tell you you're living in sin and going to hell," he said bluntly. "But I told her that what I see is a man trying to save his family's legacy while a good woman helps him do it. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you are living in sin. But it seems to me that sin's got many faces, and 2 people working honest and keeping a roof over a child's head doesn't rank high on the list of things offending the Almighty." The words were gruff, uncomfortable, clearly costing the older man something to say. But they settled into Ethan's chest like a benediction, and when Preston left, Ethan found Clara and told her what had been said. Tears sprang to her eyes, the first he'd seen from her since the night of the fire. He really said that? Every word? Clara pressed her hands to her face, shoulders shaking. When she finally lowered them, she was smiling through the tears. Maybe the whole world isn't against us after all. Maybe not, Ethan agreed. Or maybe Preston's just one decent man in a world full of judgment. Either way, I'll take it. As August gave way to September, the ranch began to look less like a disaster site and more like a working operation again. Not prosperous, they were too far from that, but functional. The fences held, the cattle, now numbering around 90 head after losing a few more to injuries and complications, grazed on grass that was slowly returning to the burned pastures. A small chicken coop stood where the old one had been, housing 8 hens that Clara had somehow charmed into laying regular. The house remained their refuge, its smoke-stained walls a constant reminder of how close they'd come to losing everything. But inside it had become something more than just shelter. Clara's touches were everywhere. Curtains she'd sewn from flour sacks, a rag rug she'd braided from scraps, the smell of bread and herbs and care that turned 4 walls into something approaching home. One evening in late September, after a particularly long day preparing for the cattle sale that was now only weeks away, Ethan found Clara on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of copper and gold. Lily was already asleep inside, and for the first time in months the air felt cool enough to hint at the winter that would follow. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Clara said as he joined her. "Even after everything, this land is still beautiful." "It is." But Ethan was looking at her rather than the sunset, at the way the light caught in her dark hair, at the strength in the lines of her face, at everything she'd become to him without either of them quite acknowledging what was happening between them. Clara turned, caught him watching, and something shifted in the air between them. "Ethan, I need to tell you something," he said before he could lose his nerve. "And I need you to let me say it all before you respond, because if I stop, I might not start again." She nodded, her dark eyes suddenly wary. "When you first arrived, I thought you were just a temporary solution to an impossible problem. Help that would last a few months before moving on. I didn't expect—" He stopped, tried to find words for feelings he barely understood himself. "I didn't expect you to matter. Didn't expect Lily to matter. Didn't expect to start thinking about the future as something other than just surviving until the next disaster." Clara's hand moved to the porch railing, gripping it tight. "Ethan, don't. Let me finish." He moved closer, close enough to see her pulse beating in her throat. "The bank extended the deadline, and if the sale goes well, I might actually be able to keep this place, or at least keep enough of it to start over properly. And when I think about that future, about what starting over means, I can't imagine it without you and Lily in it." "You're talking about obligation," Clara said quietly, but there was hope underneath the words, fragile and frightened. "About gratitude for work done and help given. That's not the same as—" "I'm talking about love," Ethan interrupted, the word falling between them like a stone dropped in still water. "I'm talking about the fact that I look at you and see not just someone who helped save my ranch, but someone I want to build a life with. I'm talking about Lily and how she started to feel like the daughter I never thought I'd have. I'm talking about waking up every morning grateful you're here and going to sleep every night terrified you'll decide to leave." Clara's breath caught, and when she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "I can't give you what you think you want. I'm not some perfect woman who can make everything right. I'm broken, Ethan. John broke something in me when he died, or maybe it was broken before, and his death just made it impossible to hide anymore. I don't know how to be what someone needs. I only know how to survive." "Then we'll survive together." Ethan reached out, cupped her face in his scarred, work-roughened hands. "I'm not asking for perfect, Clara. I'm asking for real. For partnership. For someone who'll stand beside me and tell me when I'm being stubborn or stupid or too proud for my own good. For someone who makes bread taste like redemption and silence feel like conversation and a burned ranch feel like it might actually be worth saving. And what about the town? What about all the people who already think we're living in sin? Let them think it. Or better yet—" Ethan paused, the idea forming even as he spoke it. "Marry me. Make it real in every way that matters. Not because we have to, not because of obligation or reputation, but because this thing between us, this strange, unlikely partnership, is the best thing that's happened to me in years, and I don't want to let it go." Clara stared at him, tears spilling over now, her face a study in warring emotions. "You're asking me to marry you?" "I am. Because you love me." "Yes. And because you want to build a life here, with me and Lily, on a ranch that might still fail, and a future that's still uncertain." "All of that." Ethan's thumbs brushed away her tears. "I know I'm not much of a catch. I'm in debt, I'm stubborn, and I nearly got you killed in a fire. But I'm also standing here asking you to take a chance on something that might actually work if we're both willing to fight for it." For a long moment, Clara didn't answer. She just looked at him, her eyes searching his face for something, doubt, perhaps, or insincerity, or the kind of weakness that would make this just another beautiful promise destined to break. Whatever she was looking for, she must have found its opposite, because when she finally spoke, her voice was steady despite the tears. "I'm not easy to love, Ethan. I'm particular about how things should be done. I worry too much about Lily, and I have nightmares about fire now that wake me up screaming. I'm not going to be grateful and quiet and perfectly domestic. I'm going to argue with you when I think you're wrong, and I'm going to make decisions without asking permission, and I'm going to be terrified every single day that this is all going to fall apart, like everything else in my life has fallen apart." "I know all of that. And you still want to marry me?" "I still want to marry you." Clara laughed then, a sound that was half sob, and pulled him down to kiss her, quick and fierce, and tasting of salt and hope, and all the things neither of them had dared believe they could have again. When they broke apart, both breathless, Clara pressed her forehead to his. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you. Not because it's practical, or because it will stop the gossip, or because I need someone to take care of me, but because somewhere between needing bread and fighting fire and watching you refuse to give up on this impossible ranch, I fell in love with you too." The words settled into Ethan like warmth after cold, like water after drought, like everything essential he'd been missing without knowing what to call the absence. He kissed her again, slower this time, and from inside the house came a sound that made them both freeze. Laughter. Small and rusty and unpracticed, but unmistakably laughter. They rushed inside to find Lily at the window, her small face pressed against the glass, her mouth curved in a smile that looked strange on features that had been solemn for so long. When she saw them, her smile widened, and though she still didn't speak, the joy in her expression spoke volumes. Clara dropped to her knees, pulling Lily into her arms. "Did you see, sweetheart? Did you see what happened?" Lily nodded against her mother's shoulder, and when she pulled back, she looked at Ethan with something that might have been approval or happiness or simple recognition that the world had shifted into something new and potentially good. Ethan knelt beside them, this woman he'd somehow found in his darkest hour, and this child who'd claimed a piece of his heart without saying a word. "What do you think, Lily? Can you handle having me around permanent?" Lily studied him with those solemn eyes, then slowly, deliberately, she reached out and placed her small hand in his. It was answer enough. The cattle sale came in mid-October, when the aspens had turned gold and the air carried the bite of approaching winter. Ethan drove his 90 head to Cheyenne, accompanied by Tommy Preston and 2 other hands Preston had convinced to help. The sale took all day, and when it was done, Ethan had enough money to pay half the mortgage, restock the ranch with essential supplies, and start rebuilding properly. It wasn't wealth. It wasn't even comfort. But it was survival, and more importantly, it was a future. He returned to find the house transformed for a wedding. Nothing fancy. Clara's practical nature wouldn't allow for extravagance they couldn't afford, but beautiful in its simplicity. Wildflowers from the meadow filled mason jars on the table. Clara's dress was the same gray one she'd arrived in, but cleaned and mended until it looked almost new. And standing beside her, wearing a new dress that Clara had somehow found time to sew, was Lily. The ceremony was brief, conducted by a circuit preacher who asked no questions and seemed more interested in the meal Clara had prepared than the propriety of the situation. Tommy Preston and his father stood as witnesses, along with 2 other neighbor families who'd decided that helping see a wedding through was more important than maintaining righteous judgment. When Ethan slipped a simple gold band onto Clara's finger, bought with money he probably should have spent on fence wire, and she placed a matching one on his. The words they spoke were traditional, but the meaning underneath was entirely their own. They were promising more than love and fidelity. They were promising partnership in the fullest sense, shared burden, shared hope, shared determination to make something good out of circumstances that had tried their damnedest to break them both. That night, after the guests had left and Lily had fallen asleep in her room, Ethan and Clara stood on the porch together, looking out over land that was scarred but healing, exactly like both of them. "Think we'll make it?" Clara asked, her hand in his, her wedding ring catching moonlight. "I think we'll try," Ethan answered honestly. "And I think that's all anyone can really promise. To keep trying, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." "That's not very romantic." "No, but it's true." He pulled her closer, wrapped his arms around her. "And truth's better than romance anyway. More reliable." Clara laughed, the sound fuller now, easier, carrying less weight of grief and more possibility of joy. "You're going to be an exhausting husband, Ethan Cole. And you're going to be a difficult wife, Clara Cole." He said her new name like a prayer, like something sacred and hard-won. "Good thing we're both stubborn enough to see it through." They stayed there on the porch long after the moon had risen high, talking about plans for spring planting, about whether to rebuild the barn or focus on the fencing first, about all the mundane, essential details of a life being built from ashes and choice, and stubborn refusal to let circumstances have the final word. Inside, Lily stirred in her sleep, and both of them moved without discussion to check on her. She lay peaceful under quilts Clara had brought from her old life. Her face finally relaxed in genuine rest, rather than the rigid control of enforced silence. "She's going to talk again," Clara whispered, standing in the doorway. "I feel it. She's safe enough now to find her voice." "Because you gave her somewhere safe to be," Ethan said. "You both gave me that too. Somewhere safe to fail and try again, and maybe, eventually, succeed." Clara turned to him, and in her eyes he saw everything they'd survived: fire and judgment, loss and fear, the terrible weight of trying to hold together things determined to fall apart. But he also saw what they'd built despite it all: trust, partnership, love that was earned rather than given, forged in shared hardship, in quiet moments, and the daily choice to stay when leaving would have been easier. "You know what I think?" Clara said softly. "What?" "I think we're going to make it. Not because it's easy or certain or anything like what either of us planned, but because we're both too stubborn to quit, and together, that stubbornness counts for something." She was right. Ethan knew she was right, could feel it in the way the house felt like home now, in the way Lily's laughter had sounded in the twilight, in the simple fact that three broken people had found each other and decided that broken was just another word for real, for human, for deserving of second chances. The ranch would survive. It would be smaller, rebuilt differently, shaped by loss into something unexpected but potentially stronger. The debt would take years to pay off, and there would be more struggles, more setbacks, more moments when giving up seemed like the only reasonable choice. But reasonable had never been their strong suit anyway. That night, Ethan Cole fell asleep in his own bed with his wife beside him. The woman who'd appeared like Providence when he needed it most. The woman who'd chosen to stand with him through fire and judgment and all the ordinary disasters of trying to build a life on unforgiving land. And for the first time in years, he dreamed not of loss or failure or the weight of impossible obligations, but of spring, of new grass pushing up through scorched earth, of calves being born, of bread rising in a warm kitchen, of a small girl's voice finally breaking silence to say the words that had been locked inside her too long. He dreamed of beginning again, and when dawn broke clear and cold over the ranch, painting everything in shades of possibility, he woke to find that dream was simply the truth of the life they were already living. Imperfect, hard-won, real, and more than enough.